very good morning to Austria and good evening here in Australia. I hope you can all hear me. Warm welcome to the webinar Postings from Austria to Australia and what you need to consider when sending your staff on business to Australia. My name is Ulrike Stracker. I'm the Austrian Trade Commissioner in Australia, but also for New Zealand and the Pacific region. And before we go on, let me just say that we are happy to welcome you all inside. Could I have a sign of life from some of the participants? Can you hear us? Oh, hi, Georg. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for reaching out. So, before we go into our subject, I wanted to give you just a very brief introduction to what's going on in the Australian economy and the sentiment here in Australia at the moment. So after the election of President Trump and the announcements of tariffs on China and a couple of other countries, Australia is, of course, also a bit worried if China should be hit by such tariffs, then this might also impact the Australian economy, given that more than a third of Australian exports go to China. So this is something to watch out for, and Australian exporters would also need to make sure that their supply chains do not involve certain countries that come under the tariff threat of the Trump administration. Other topics discussed in Australia at the moment are the housing crisis, a shortage of housing. It's a topic we will address with an event later this year in May, talking about housing and modern methods of construction with Austrian companies participating. Cost of living is a big topic in Australia. Inflation is high. And up to today, actually, the Reserve Bank of Australia had kept interest rates high at 4.35% and only today brought them down to 4.1%. Federal elections in Australia are coming up, probably in March, April, or May. Latest, it would have to be May. And everybody is waiting for Premier Albanese to announce a date for these elections. And regarding the events of Advantage Austria in Australia, of the Austrian Trade Commission, I would like to tell you that we are bringing a delegation, or rather the European Australian Business Council is bringing a delegation to Vienna in June, and we will host a joint event in the Federal Economic Chamber in the Wirtschaftskammer Österreich. So if apart from today's topic, you have any questions surrounding your business in Australia, or we can assist you in any way, we would be happy for you to reach out to us. Let me now introduce the presenters of today's webinar. We're doing this webinar jointly with Claudia Vasco, immigration lawyer and founder of Vasco Migration. Claudia, please switch on your camera and yeah, hi Claudia.
Good morning.
Hello. Very good to have you here.
Thank you.
And you will speak about the visa side, the immigration side of posting people to Australia. And we will also have Gunnar Kebisch, partner of business services of the tax advisory and so much more, BDO, here in Sydney. Gunnar, hi.
Good morning.
Great to have you. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Ulrike.
So I will begin with Claudia. I met Claudia for the first time at Export Tag when I still wasn't posted in Sydney, and it's always good to remember that you were part of my start to Australia. You studied law in Vienna and in Sydney and specialized in Australian migration law. And you started Vasco Migration Private Limited in 2007. So together with your team, who's operating in a couple of cities, I was quite surprised to see that you are not only based in Vienna and Sydney, but also in Prague, Bratislava, and Rijeka. So you specialize in business and skilled migration, temporary and permanent work visas, as well as family visas. And you advise already a large number of corporate clients in Australia and Europe. So we haven't seen you in Sydney for a while. Good to have you online. And so Claudia, why don't we get started into your presentation? Just a short note to our participants. We would love to have your questions. If there is enough time, also you could unmute at the end of our presentations, but you could already type into the chat and we will take up the questions in a bit. Technicalities, the webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy in the next few days. You'll receive a link to watch it again. And with this, I hand over to you, Claudia. The floor is yours.
Here we go. You should all see the slides now. Good evening, good morning to everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. I would like to talk about the recent legislative changes today that were introduced to the visa rules in December 2024, and I would also like to talk about two of the other most commonly used visas that are probably of interest to all of you or most of you. I would like to start with the one of the most commonly used visas, which is the so-called sponsorship visa. It's a subclass 482 visa that's been that has replaced the old 457 visa a few years ago, and is an employer-sponsored visa. In December, there have been a lot of changes to the 482 visa. And one of the first changes was that the government changed the name of the visa. So it is no longer called a temporary skills shortage visa, but these days it's called a skills in demand visa. I'd like to point out that all previously granted 482 visas keep their validity and are not affected by any of the changes. What has not changed? The 482 visa is still a 3-stage process. So you still need to have your business approved as a business sponsor by the Department of Home Affairs, whether that is an Australian incorporated entity or an overseas business. That's the first step. The second step is you need to lodge a nomination to the Department of Home Affairs where you nominate a position that needs to be filled. And the third step is the visa application where your employer applies for the nominated position. If your business is already an approved sponsor, then the first step falls away, and then you only have to lodge a nomination and a visa application. Unfortunately, still in place is the labour market testing, which is more or less a formality, and everyone, including the Department of Home Affairs, knows that. It's more of a political instrument. Labour market testing means that before you can lodge an application, you need to advertise the position for at least 4 weeks to demonstrate to DHA that there are no suitable Australians for the job. In reality, what it means is that a company usually contacts us and says, we would like to sponsor Mr. Miller, and then we start the labour market testing. So we already know before the labour market testing who will actually be the visa applicant, but we still need to run the adverts for 4 weeks, and then which obviously delays the process. So we usually use the 4 weeks to prepare all the documents for the application, and then as soon as the 4 weeks are over, we can lodge the application. We were hoping this would be abolished, but it hasn't been. There are, though, some exemptions to labour market testing, especially if you transfer an employee from your overseas headquarters to your subsidiary or from a sister company to Australia, then we can claim an exemption. Also, certain nationalities get an exemption. For instance, British nationals under the new the trade agreement. So we would claim an exemption where possible because it saves time and quite a lot of effort in posting ads and collecting applications. So that's what has not changed. What has changed? The 482 visa is now divided into 3 streams. The first stream we have is the specialist stream. That's for all your senior positions, your senior managers, professional or tradespeople who you would like to either second to Australia or employ locally in Australia. For this group of people, there's no occupations list, but they only need to have an annual salary of at least $135,000 or higher. The second stream, which is probably covers the majority of all applications, is for all other applications. For those, you need to have an occupation on the core skills occupations list. That's a very new list. And your employees will have to have an annual minimum salary that is at Australian market rates and above 7,350,000 Australian dollars. And the third stream probably does not apply to most of you. It's a labour agreement stream. This is mainly for companies who are based in regional Australia and who would like to sponsor people for occupations that are not listed on the skills occupations list. So this is usually for people working in the meat industry or truck drivers, so things like that. So what does that mean? In practice, this means that if you wish to sponsor someone, then usually you email me the position description and the resume for the person. And then we'll have a look and assess whether he or she meets the requirements. We'll then ask for the salary. If it's a managerial or professional or trades occupation and the salary is above 135,000, you would proceed under the specialist stream. If not, you would proceed under the core stream. Both have the same requirements apart from whether they're listed on that skilled list or not. Also new is because we have one combined skills list and not 2 anymore, you can now get a 482 visa for up to 4 years. Previously, we had 2 lists, and for one list, you could only get it for 2 years. For the other list, you could get it for 4 years. So that's a good change. It means you can choose whether you need someone 1, 2, 3, or 4 years in Australia. The government increased the English requirements, so you need a higher English test, but there are also exemptions, especially for intercompany transfers, which apply to a lot of you and which we will use wherever we can as well. Unfortunately, the government increased the application fees. Previously, we had 2 different application fees for one list, for each of the 2 lists. Now we have one. And of course, the government picked the higher fee across the whole 482 visa stream. And lastly, you have an easier pathway to permanent residence these days, which means previously you had to have a 482 visa holder employed for 2 years in the same position with your business before you could nominate him or she for permanent residence. Nowadays, if you have a 482 visa holder on your books for, say, 6 months, but that person has held a 482 visa for 18 months with a different company before, we can actually count the whole period the person has spent on a 482 visa. And as soon as they have a total of 2 years, you can nominate them for permanent residence, which is great. The age limit is still 45 for permanent residence. There's still no age limit for the sponsorship 482 visa. And as a last change, the government reduced the requirements for work experience, whereas previously it was 2 years after your formal qualification. Now it is reduced to 1 year. So that's pretty good as well. And you can substitute a formal qualification with 3 or 5 years work experience, depending on which occupation you nominate. Some practical advice now in regards to processing times. as many of you may have experienced, the immigration had extremely long processing times last year. That was due to the fact that they received 70% more applications last year. That blew out to processing times of 6-7 months, which was really tough for a lot of you. Immigration has promised us that under the new stream, they will try to reduce processing times down to, they even say 2 weeks from when your medical or police clearances are cleared. At the moment, we see them come back after about 6 weeks. So we're seeing an improvement, but we're not quite at the level where we would like to be. That's it for the 482 visa. The next visa is the subclass 400 visa. That's one of my favorite visa subclasses. It is a short stay work visa. It's a fabulous visa for short-term, not ongoing, highly skilled work in Australia for up to 6 months. What does that mean? It means that if you need to send someone to Australia for a shorter period of time, up to 6 months in a 12-month period, that's the visa you will apply for. Why is it so great? It is good because it does not have 3 steps. It only has 1 step. It's only one visa application. They're processed offshore, so they're not processed in Australia, but they're processed at the Australian embassies overseas. Most of our 400 applications are processed at the Australian Embassy in Belgrade. They usually, the published processing time is about 2 to 4 weeks. At the moment, we're getting them back in 1 to 2 weeks. So they're really fabulous. If you need someone urgently in Australia, you apply, you don't need police clearances, you don't need an English test, there's no sponsorship, there's no labour market testing, so you can have the documents together in a few days or a week. Then you lodge the application, and as soon as it is approved, your employee can travel to Australia and work there. The only issue is sometimes the short term is not long enough. So sometimes, like for a lot of you who work with a lot of projects, it is anticipated that the work is done in 3 or 6 months, but then there are delays, and then the 6 months are not enough. And then it becomes a problem because you cannot extend the 400 visa while you are physically in Australia. So that means you have to leave Australia, and then we would have to check how much time your employee has actually already spent in Australia. If they had a visa that was valid for 6 months, but they've only spent 3 months in Australia, we can get him or her another 3 months subclass 400 visa to make up for the total allowed amount of 6 months in a 12-month period. If they have already spent 6 months in Australia in the last 12 months, you cannot apply for another 400 visa, but you would have to get them a 482 sponsorship visa, which of course takes longer to be processed, takes longer to be prepared, and so on. So ideally, I know sometimes you need a crystal ball to know in advance, will the 6 months be okay or will they not be okay? If they're not okay, you're better off getting the 482 visa straight away, because that will save your employee from going to Australia in a 400, leaving again, and then 2 months later being able to return to Australia. In the 400 application, you need to list all the work locations where your employee will be working. That can be one, it can also be several work locations. And then he or she will be allowed to work in all these locations in the job that he's placed. I think that covers it for the 400 visa. Yeah, the fees, they're quite cheap. The immigration department only charges $420 for a subclass 400 visa. And as I said, no character documents, no English tests, no labor market testing. So really a good visa. And that brings me to my last visa for today, which is, as you probably all know, the e-visitor visa. It's a subclass 651. It has 2 streams. It has a visitor stream, that's for your typical tourists who come to Australia, and it has a business stream, and that's the one I would like to quickly run through. It allows you to stay in Australia for up to 6 months from the date of arrival. And it only allows business visitor activities, and they are very clearly defined in the migration regulations. So what is a business visitor activity? It is strictly only for meetings, general business inquiries, employment inquiries, negotiating, entering into contracts, being part of an official government visit, and to participate in a conference, a seminar, or a trade fair. What's not included? Not included is to come to Australia to work. Any kind of work is not included. So what that means is that typically you would have a manager who will come to Australia to hold meetings, to enter into a contract. What's not included is if you have senior project manager who comes to Australia to go on site, supervise your technicians, do some work, because that's actually his job and that's actually his work. So it's not always clear. Sometimes there's a gray area, but it is really important that if anything is not a business visitor activity, that you do not enter on a visitor visa, but you get a 400 visa. And as I said before, you can get them within a short period of time and they don't cost a fortune. Because if you enter on a 651, it can be quite risky, not just for the applicant, but also for you as a business. Immigration does not like it if someone does not enter Australia on the appropriate visa. They have a lot of different visa subclasses and they tell you to apply for the appropriate visa. If you visit, you come on a visitor visa. If you work, you come on a work visa, either short-term or long-term. If you don't do this, it will be put on the record and it will affect every future visa application you will be lodging for your employees. And that means longer processing times, more questions asked, and they'll just give you a hard time. Also be careful, Australia scans all luggage on arrival. So it's not a good idea to come on a 651 visa and have tools, samples, work clothes in your luggage, because it will show up. Also, if you go to Australia a lot on a 651 visa and always max it out to the 3 months, you leave, you come back, you leave, you come back. At some point, you will be interviewed on arrival. And be mindful that immigration is allowed to open and actually check your laptop. They know about your immigration history. They know exactly how much time you've spent in Australia, and they're specifically trained to ask you and interrogate you on your planned activities in Australia. On that note, I would like to finish. I would just like to say that whatever visa you need, there is most likely a visa subclass for it. Australia has over 100 different visa subclasses, so feel free to apply for the appropriate one and you will not have any problems. And on that note, I would like to hand over to Gunnar.
May I just come in before Gunnar gets started, because I haven't yet introduced him properly. So, Gunnar, you have been working in your field for over 15 years. You're a partner of BDO Business Services team, partner of the BDO's European desk. You are with a Master of Economics, an affiliate member, Chartered Accountants in Australia and New Zealand. And your expertise is in outsourced management and financial reporting, in income and fringe benefits tax, in setting up subsidiaries of multinational corporations, and in payroll. So that qualifies you to assist foreign companies with the full range of services, from setup and registration through payroll, management reporting to year-end tax and accounting compliance. Gunnar, I've done a couple of events with you. I'm very happy that we're doing this webinar together. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Uli. And thank you, Claudia, for the presentation about visas, because we find often the visas and are followed by the tax questions, or the other way around. We get tax questions and then it goes back to, well, what visa do you have? Or what is the activity in Australia? So it's very intertwined. those both topics. So I would like to give a quick overview about the registration requirements in Australia for employers and employees. First, to set up business here, what does it mean? And then also from a taxation point, what do you need to look out for, where you might have to lodge certain statements, pay certain taxes that are not often on the radar if someone comes to Australia. Okay, I hope everyone can see my presentation. Okay, so just a quick overview, and then I will also quickly talk about social insurances, especially pension insurance. Our Australian superannuation system is a question that often comes up. Okay, so let's start with registration requirements for employers. So if you want to send someone to Australia and you might even want to sponsor someone, as Claudia mentioned, you will have to register your business in some form or another in Australia. There are two ways of doing this. You can incorporate a subsidiary, your PDY Limited, which many of you have. I actually see quite a lot of familiar names on the call. Or you can register as a foreign entity and operate as a branch in Australia. So those two registration would happen with the Australian Security Investment Commission, ASIC in short form. Just one point to make is that over the last couple of years, there's a new requirement for directors of especially foreign entities. They will require to have an Australian Director Identification Number, a DIN, which they can apply for from overseas. It does require a bit of paper forms, certified translated ID documentation, but otherwise your entity won't be registered in Australia, or you can't be a director of a PDY Limited in Australia. Once you've done all the registrations, you need to register the Australian Taxation Office, the ATO, to get your Australian business number. And especially in the topic of visas and expats, you can register for pay-as-you-go withholding, which is our tax that is withheld on payroll. It's not called a payroll tax. That's a different topic that often gets confused. So we call the tax that gets withheld from your gross salary, we call that pay-as-you-go withholding. In Australia, we have an electronic lodgement system for payroll that goes directly to the tax office. It's called Single Touch Payroll, which means if you run a payroll in Australia, you do the calculation for your employees on the pay date or before. You have to lodge an electronic file. Normally it's in the software built in and automatically lodges all those details of the tax office. So the tax office straight away knows who got paid, what amounts, and on what day. One point important to point out, the registration with ASIC, it can take a long time. ASIC is very specific with the documentation requirements, with the translations. We find a lot of questions come back around even translation of Umlaute, the Ü in the overseas registration documents, etc. So ASIC says 28 days is the processing time, but from experience the last 2 years it has blown out. Similar to the visas, it can take 3-4 months till the ASIC registration has been processed, which is very long, unfortunately. Okay, so once you've done all the registration, your employees have the right visa to come to Australia, then it's the question, what do you do for the payroll? So first instance, you run the payroll, you would have to withhold taxes on the Australian salaries. There are different withholding tax rates depending on the residency status of those employees. That goes back to the visa. So on the 482 visa, for example, where you would most likely be here for 2 years or longer, you would be a tax resident. So you would the same rates would apply to you as they do for any Australian citizens that's living here. If you come on a working holiday visa or a short-term business visa, you might be considered a non-resident for tax purpose, and then there are different rates applying to the withholding on the salary. What you also need to consider is workers' compensation insurance. In Australia, that is basically our insurance for any accidents that happen at work. So your expat employees also have to be taken into consideration, added to that insurance, similar to payroll tax. So payroll tax, not to be confused with the pay-as-you-go withholding tax. Payroll tax is a state-specific tax that is paid on the total payroll cost. In each state, so there's New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, Western Australia, Australian Territory, Northern Territory, has a different threshold of your overall Australian salary cost on which you might have to pay payroll tax in each state, depending on employees in each state. Very complex system. The rates are around 4.5%, 5%, depending on the state. So it can get very expensive. And often what we see is that, especially the expat employees are missed and not included. But because of the lodgement of the single touch payroll and the payroll, it will come up with the Office of State Revenue in some form. And then the questions are asked, there are default notices sent, and then there are penalties of 25%, interest on top of any late payments. So it can get very expensive, and it's often missed, unfortunately. One concept that's also important in that space of having expat employees working for your Australian company is that concept of a deemed employer. Because often in that topic, there is sort of that 183 days in Australia is sort of floating around as a point of, if I'm here for less than that, there's nothing to do. If I'm longer, then yes. But the topic of deemed employer basically means that if you send an employee to Australia working for your Australian subsidiary, let's say for 3 or 4 months, often we see the case that it said, oh, it's only 3 or 4 months. We don't have to do payroll. We don't have to do payroll tax. We don't have to workers' comp. But if the employee is working in the subsidiary, if the cost of the employee's salary are borne by the subsidiary, either in the form of recharge from head office or direct payment from the subsidiary to the employee, and in that form become tax deductible in Australia, the tax office sees it as the employer here in Australia is the employer of that expat employee, and then that salary cost would have to be included in the insurance, in the payroll tax, and all those topics. So it's a bit of a case-by-case basis. How long are people here? How are they paid? Where are they paid? What is recharged? And what visa do they have? So there's not a black and white answer. It really depends on each situation. Okay, and then the requirements for the employee itself, for the individual itself. So if they have the right visa, they have the right to work in Australia. I found it interesting, Claudia's comment about the 651 visa. We've seen cases where people come and go on multiple 651 visas back to back, and the questions get asked. In worst case, they're even getting paid here, or there is a payroll, and so it can get messy and expensive if something comes up. But if an employee comes here to Australia and works here, they need a tax file number. There are 2 ways to apply for a tax file number. That can be done locally online or from overseas. The online process is very straightforward. The employee will need his passport number, some personal details, and then it gets cross-checked with the Department for Immigration if the employee is in the country, and there's normally no problem. The process from overseas requires a lot of paperwork, a lot of translated certified ID documentation, and all this has to be lodged as originals with the ATO, and the processing times can be many months. So we always sort of say it's probably better to just come here, first few days in Australia, do the application online. It's a lot easier than doing this from overseas. Once the employees are here, depending on the circumstance of the social insurance, they also have to choose a superannuation fund where any superannuation would be paid. But we'll touch on the topic later because there are potentially exemptions from paying superannuation in Australia. And then, of course, often the question is, what tax do I pay in Australia? As mentioned before, there are resident and non-resident tax rates. I've listed them here. It's probably a bit too much information, but the main point is that for non-residents, basically taxes apply from the first dollar of income. while for residents there's a tax-free threshold, and then the rates are a little bit lower at the start, so normally more favorable. As a note, those rates don't include Medicare, which is our Australian health insurance, which I will touch on later as well. From the taxation of those export employees, depending again on the visa, in many cases, only the Australian sourced income is taxed in Australia. That means, for a standard example, someone is coming to Australia as a sales manager or managing director of a subsidiary. He's coming on a 482 visa. He's not entitled to any Australian social security payments like Medicare. He would only have to declare the income from his employment in Australia, any interest he might receive from Australian bank account, etc. But he would not have to declare income of the same apartment he's owning overseas in Austria and he's renting out. He would not have to declare that rent in Australia. Most likely he would have to do so in Austria. One point that sometimes complicates things a bit with tax credits is that Australia has a 30 June financial year end. This year end can be changed for companies, but it can't be changed for payroll and individual tax purpose. So you often find the situation your business might have a financial year end of 31st December to bring it in line with head office. But for payroll purpose, the financial year is still July to June, and the same applies to the individuals. So the tax return would be for the same period. So there could be an overlap with overseas returns depending on the time of travel. Once the visa changes and someone becomes a permanent resident, as Claudia mentioned, is a bit easier now. Then the worldwide income would be taxed in Australia as for any Australian citizen. Okay, so the topic of social insurance, always a big topic, especially for secondments for 1 or 2 years. So in Australia, in general, our pension system is called superannuation, which means on top of the gross income, the employer has to pay at the moment 11.5% to a super fund of the employee's choice. That rate will go up to 12% later this year. And the employee can choose a super fund where it gets paid into. It's basically an investment fund. For visa holders, there is the option, once the visa ends and the employee leaves Australia and moves back to his home country, to get the balance paid out. But the payout is taxed at 32%, and the paying in at the start is taxed at 50%. The payout is taxed at 32% again. So it's roughly a 47% tax on those contributions. So after a couple of years, there is often not much left. There is the possibility to get exemption from paying into superannuation in Australia. And there is a rough guide. If the employee is still part or still has his place of living in Austria, he plans to go back to Austria, and he's still part in the Austrian social insurance system. There is a form, I think it's called now the form A1. It used to be A101, which basically proves that the employee is still part of the overseas social insurance. Then he might be exempt from paying superannuation in Australia, so that the employer doesn't have to pay pension insurance basically in 2 countries. Then in Australia, on the payroll side, as I mentioned, we have this pay-as-you withholding, and that is all there is. So we don't have any different withholdings, different taxes for pension or other insurances. It's really just pay-as-you-go withholding. And in the pay-as-you-go withholding, there is the part for the health insurance, what we call Medicare, is built in that part of the withholding. As a temporary visa holder, usually you're not entitled to Medicare, but we can't really take it out of the pay-as-you-go calculation. So you're basically paying 2% to the government for something you're not entitled to receive. Because of that, when the employee, the individual lodges their tax returns, they can apply to Medicare for confirmation of the exemption that they're not entitled, and then they can get a refund for that portion of the tax they've already paid when they lodge their individual tax return. There is an option to apply for variation before any withholding. It is a bit of a process and it would have to be done annually. So we often find the individuals just do once a year the Medicare form and then tick the box in return to get that portion of the Medicare that was withheld back. Private health insurance, as far as I know, it's often mandatory for temporary visa holders. I hope that is correct, because they're not entitled to Medicare. It is voluntary for permanent residents, so many Australians have Medicare and a private health insurance, but I'm sure for temporary visa holders that would be a mandatory requirement to even enter Australia, because otherwise they would have no insurance in Australia. Okay, that was my presentation. Just a quick overview what to look out for, especially from an employer side. I think it's easy to send someone here, but it's then very easy to forget workers' compensation, payroll tax, especially if there are multiple subsidiaries in Australia, and it can unfortunately get expensive if the authorities find it out a year or 2 years later. Yeah, that's my part.
Gunnar, thank you very much. May I ask the participants to write their questions into the chat? There is also Fragen and Antworten, question and answer, where you can add your questions. And so may I start by asking Claudia, are there common mistakes that companies make when applying for Australian visa, and how can you avoid those mistakes?
Where do I start, Uli? Yes, there are. I mean, a lot of the times people think, or companies think, I will send this person on a 651 and it will all be good. And in fact, that's, as I said, very often a gray area, especially for senior people. Is it work or is it just a meeting? Whereas meetings are a lot of the time they are part of the job. So that's not often, or very often not an easy decision to make. That's one. Then for the 400 visa, let me think. It's important that all the locations are listed, so that you don't just put down the address of the subsidiary and then they travel all over Australia to various projects and work there, because very often on projects you have a lot of subcontractors. They obviously talk you. Sometimes you have the unions there if it's a big project, and that can cause problems. And it's not an issue to list 5 or even 10 work locations in a subclass 400 application. So that's very easy to avoid. For the work visa, I mean, it's hard for me to say what are the most common mistakes, because we make sure there are, we make sure the requirements are met, the legal requirements are met. So when we prepare the application, we make sure, is labour market testing required? If yes, then we do it. If not, we'll explain to Home Affairs why it is. And so we make sure the requirements are met. And what I see a lot from overseas companies, and this is where I then talk to Gunnar or to Wolfgang as well, is they are reluctant to register in Australia if it's purely an overseas business that does not have a subsidiary in Australia, because they think, well, why should I lodge an ARBN number in Australia and then having to lodge my tax returns or my financial statements every year? It's costly. We don't want to disclose it. What's the purpose? So this is where a lot of companies don't do that, or didn't do that in the past and got away with it. But nowadays, immigration changed the online application as well. So you actually do not get away without it. And that can be quite lengthy. As Gunnar said, sometimes it can take 2 months, or they throw it back because, I don't know, the signature didn't match the signature there, or there was a certification missing or whatever. So that then delays us launching the application as well.
So that a lot of planning is required and you would advise companies to plan well ahead.
Yes, you cannot start early enough.
Okay. Gunnar, the concept of tax equalization and how can it be implemented to ensure that expatriate employees are not financially disadvantaged? We've heard a couple you've mentioned a couple of programs there.
Yeah, so what we see quite a bit are contracts that basically have a agreement on a net salary, and then the company pays the tax in Australia based on the calculation, depending on the circumstances. So that's what we see quite a bit. Often those agreements are in euros. Then there's always the question around exchange rate. The Australian dollar can fluctuate quite a bit as well. So it would need to be some consideration how to deal with that. Yeah, it's probably the main part. So the company probably, again, it goes, I think the planning is a big part. It's the planning for any registration for the visa, and also sort of to have a calculation at the start already to not get caught out with any tax rates that are surprised in any exchange rates.
That's what I get.
You also have the fringe benefit tax in Australia, which I didn't mention because it's more of a remuneration topic, but it also can get expensive if you pay employees rent his apartment. You basically pay the same amount in tax on top of that. So planning again is very important, I think, to not get caught out with any taxes or late registrations and breaching certain timelines and thresholds.
Claudia, you wanted to?
Yes, what I wanted to say is that we have this a lot as well when we have when Austrian or German companies second someone to Australia, and their contract or the salary in the contract is in euros, and they'll also still be paid into a European bank account. If we do a subclass 482 visa, we need in the application, we must give the amounts in Aussie dollars, because the risk of an exchange rate fluctuation cannot be with the visa holder. It needs to be with the company. However, if they're still being paid in Europe and if they're monitored later, then it'll depend on the exchange rate. So what we then usually do is we usually give a slightly lower income in the application in Aussie dollars, just to make up for some possible exchange rate changes. But this for us only applies to the 482 visa, because for the 400 visa, for the short-term visa, most people are not even employed locally in Australia. You can, but a lot of them are your typical, short-term workers who go to Australia to implement something at a subsidiary in Australia, maybe a new software or some structures from some policies from head office, or technicians who go on project sites. So they never have an intention of staying in Australia permanently or longer. They go there, they still stay on the payroll here in Europe, and that's fine. Yeah. Also, they don't even need to be employed by the company for the 400 visa. So a company can even send someone for who's a contractor to them. Whereas on the 482 visa, you must be employed by the sponsoring employer. There's no contracting possible.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming in through the chat. One is, us in German. I can also translate if you want. Which services out of the healthcare system are available under the public super fund, or are all services of the private super fund to be paid? I'm not sure that who asked that question is quite clear on the system.
Yeah, maybe quickly. So the superannuation is really just a pension insurance. So let's say the salary is $100,000 per year, $11,500 get paid into the employees' super fund that they can choose. And roughly the employee can only access that money when they turn 65 years old, right? If they have temporary visa, they can potentially access that money when they leave Australia. But again, then the payout is taxed at 32%. There are no services around that. It's really, just the pension system in Australia. Services from the social side are Medicare, which there would be no entitlement under temporary visas. There are certain social security like childcare payments, rebates, etc., where normally temporary residents or temporary visa holders most likely not have access to.
Okay, next question. When sending someone for business and insurance within the Austrian social security system, private advance payment of what do you recommend? Private advance payment of medical assistance and then getting a refund? Can the same services be accessed in Australia that are also offered in Austria and Social Security is covering them?
Not 100% sure of the question, but if you have a private health insurance in Australia, we do have, I would assume, the same services from a health perspective. I'm not sure about the Austrian side, if you can access any Austrian social security payments while you're in Australia. I'm not sure how the Austrian social security system works with that. It's more around the superannuation that if you keep paying in Austria and you get that Form 8.1, then you could be exempt from having to pay into the Australian superannuation system.
That's for the pension, right? Yeah.
That's
so
for
the medical insurance, people who are sent over here would need a private insurance.
Yes. And I think that is also mandatory because of the visa. Is that right, Claudia?
Yes, yeah. Yes. So the if you hold a 482 visa, you must hold private health insurance at a certain legal minimum cover. Yeah, so you can't just take out any insurance. It has to be at a certain cover, at a certain range, and that must be taken out from the day you arrive in Australia, and then you can pay it monthly. They're not that expensive. Yeah? So most big insurance providers have designed insurance packages that meet those 482 visa requirements. So they're about 107 Aussie dollars per month or so. So it's really not too much to be insured. Whereas for the 400 and the 651 visa, there's no legal requirement under visa rules to hold insurance, private insurance in Australia. We usually recommend to take out travel insurance. That's enough. And most large corporations have corporate travel insurance anyways for their employees. It's the only thing that you need to be careful is that they sometimes have a limit on the duration of the trip. So sometimes they have per trip, it can only be a 6 months trip. So if it's, 651 business trip for meetings, fine. If it's a 400, it's only valid for 6 months anyways, they return home, fine. But for the 482 visa, if they live in Australia and work there, then it's not advisable to use the corporate travel insurance, even if it's at that limit, at that minimum limit, because if you have that limitation of, say, a maximum for 6 months trip, you probably will not go back to Australia every 6 months to then renew the 6 months.
Claudia, I'll just add this question. If senior management spends a couple of months per trip, maximum below 6 months per year, but spread over 12 months, is this possible under the 400 visa, as visits are spread over 12 months? If senior management receives no compensation, also no foreign income, as a fact, is this a problem under the 400 visa?
The answer to both questions is yes, it's possible, and no, it's not a problem. What you need to be careful is that immigration grants it for 6 months at a time, and the 6 months start not when it's approved. So say the visa is approved today, then the 6 months will not run from the 18th of Feb, but they will start running from the day you first arrive in Australia. So say if you arrive on the 1st of March, the 400 visa will be valid until the 1st of September. And then you leave. And then if you've only spent 3 months in Australia in those 6 months, you can get it for another 3 months. And again, the 3 months will start counting in again from the day of arrival. So you can spread out the 6 months over a 12 months period, but you will need 2 400s for that because they will not grant it to you for 12 months. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And as I said, payments, most employees or most, managers or even, technicians who go to Australia in a 400, they stay on the overseas payroll. We see it in maybe only 10-15% of the cases that people transfer to the Australian payroll.
Okay, we've got one other question that just came into the chat. Give me a moment. What is the overall cost of 400 visa application, including advisory services?
So I can only speak for myself. So for us, overall, including all the immigration fees, it's approximately $2,000 to $2,500. Yeah, depending on the circumstances. You can also include family. If someone brings the family to Australia, then immigration will charge per family member as well. Usually there are no medical checks required unless the visa holder has been to a high-risk country in the last 3 years. So this all needs to be disclosed. So if you need to do a medical check, obviously that needs to be paid extra. That's another couple of $100. Usually you don't need police clearances unless the person has a criminal record, then you need police clearances. You need to explain it. So that costs a bit of extra money as well.
Claudia, something I overlooked. After the visa is granted, are there any ongoing requirements, compliance requirements that employer or employees have to observe?
Yes. Every visa holder, until he or she is a permanent resident, must notify immigration of any changes in circumstances. That means a new passport because, for instance, because every visa is linked not to your name, but to your passport number. So if you have a new passport, you let us know and we will link the visa online to the new passport number and you're good to travel again. If you change address, immigration wants to know. If you change your phone number, if you change your marital status, say on a 482 visa, someone gets married or they have a child, they need to be added to the application because otherwise the baby will not have a visa. What else? Also, if they're under the 482 visa, if there are any changes to the company, say if they have a new MD or if they change address or anything else, anything that's substantial, we need the visa holder or the company has an obligation to notify immigration within 28 days. So it has to be done quite quickly. Also, if they terminate their employment on the 482 visa, we need to notify immigration. And if people let us know, then we do it on their behalves to make sure that everyone is compliant.
Okay, great. We are almost up with time, or the hour is gone so quickly. Would you like to have some last words to our audience? Gunnar, anything you would recommend?
Planning. I think that's, as you mentioned before, everything takes longer than you expect in first instance. plan properly for it, so all the documentations and registrations can be done on time, and also calculate properly, ask the right questions about what needs to be paid, what needs to be taxed, etc. So there are no bad surprises. Otherwise, it's very nice in Australia, so someone wants to come, can only recommend.
Great, and I'm sure you'll be there for follow-up questions if the companies or our participants tonight need some more information.
Of course.
They can contact you. We will share this information with you, with all our participants, of course. Claudia?
I think I'd just like to thank everyone who we've been working with, because we've had a really good really good cooperations with all of you who I can see here, and thank you for providing us with all the documents. And I know it's such a nitty-gritty area which is really boring and dull, but unfortunately it needs to be done, and we're happy to assist and take as much work off you where we can and answer as many questions as we can. Thank you. Thank you, Uli. Thank you, Gunnar.
Thank you very much to Gunnar Kebisch. BDO has already switched off the lights, I think. And Claudia, thank you very much for joining us from Austria. Thank you to all participants. We look forward to keeping in touch with you. Have a great rest of the week. Thank you. Good evening. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye.